Hi everyone, I'm Ian Harvey, massage therapist. This is my friend Summer.
Hey.
Today we're going to be talking about how to use the forearm and elbow for deep tissue massage. Now, if you've seen my videos, you probably noticed that my go-to is the soft fist. If I want to really sink in and apply a lot of pressure, I typically use this tool. I'll have a video about tips and tricks for the soft fist sometime. I use this primarily because I have my table set so low. You can't see it because I can't zoom out any further than that. Room is kind of tiny. But my table is very low. It's at about the top of my knee. So I use a very low table because that allows me to use these straight arms. It allows me to lean against the table and be very lazy through my massage strokes. Versus using my forearm, I have to bend down quite a bit. So these techniques might work better for you if you use a higher table, but I'll also give you some good tips if you like to use this lower table, because every minute that you spend using your forearm and elbow to do massage is one less minute that you're compressing this wrist joint, that you're putting pressure on these metacarpophalangeal joints. The forearm and the elbow are perfect if you want to take some of the stress off of your hands, fingers, thumbs, wrists. Let's talk about some strategies for using your forearm. Now, the most common mistake that I see in forearm use is using it as a static, stable instrument. Just kind of making this angle with your elbow and then using the forearm like that. Used properly, the forearm can be a very flowing, sensitive instrument. Some of you at home may not use your elbow a lot because you feel like it's not very sensitive. I can't feel as much. Well, you'll never be able to read Braille with your forearm, but you will be able to sense a lot of the tissue going on under your arm if you flow with the surface under your tool here. So that means conforming to this three-dimensional body, rather than expecting it to conform to your arm. What do I mean by conform? I mean I'm constantly changing this angle, I'm constantly changing the angle at my elbow, and I'm constantly changing my amount of pronation and supination. So here's what that means for your client. When you're in a supine wrist position, that brings your ulna directly into contact with their body. It can feel a little bit sharper. Versus when you pronate your wrist right here, that brings a lot of these flexor muscles in contact with their body, so it's a much softer sensation. So the ulna is good for getting into tight spaces, like if I want to dodge between her neck and her scapula here, I can use that ulna. But then as I clear that, I can pronate my wrist, change this angle to meet this new sloping surface, and then continue on with that stroke. Another mistake that I see is relying too much on this olecranon process or using it when you might not necessarily mean to. When I'm using my forearm, I'm primarily using my ulna. So the broad length of this ulna, and the olecranon is kind of trailing behind, but I'm not putting a lot of my weight into it. Now this can be a great tool for applying a lot of pressure to a very small surface area, so it can be good for working on trigger points. It can be good for working with very, very deep pressure type clients. But I tend to keep it out of the equation probably 90 or 95% of the time. So a typical stroke down the back would look like this for me. So I'm starting with the ulna, and then you'll notice that I'm slowly pronating so that it's coming into the anterior portion of my forearm, that hairless portion that houses all of your finger and wrist flexors. And the more slack your hand is, the softer this will feel. Versus, if I were to have a rigid hand and wrist, this would feel quite blunt. It wouldn't be as able to conform to your client's body. If you do want to use this olecranon process and you're a little worried about hitting some of these vertebral processes or bumping over some of these ribs, and you want to make it feel softer while still applying a good amount of pressure to a small space, then you can wrap your elbow with your other hand. So I'm going to place my hand on the body. This is a nice comforting broad surface. And then I place my own tip of my elbow in the crook between my thumb and my forefinger here. And now I have a lot of nice sensory information coming in from this supporting hand, and a lot of nice pressure coming in using this elbow. This can be done static or it can be done moving. Allow your fingers and your thumb to kind of give you constant information about where you are, and allow that olecranon process to travel with the other hand. Make them one unit. And you can change their configuration as you get further down. But making sure that they move as one unit will make it all feel like a very cohesive experience, and it will add a lot of comfort to what could otherwise be a very deep and possibly pointy tool. Now that we've talked about some of the basics of forearm and elbow use, let's give some specific techniques that you can use. I like to use my forearms whenever I want to integrate broad areas of the body. So here I'm primarily using this anterior surface of my forearm where all those flexors live. And I'm spreading this thoracolumbar fascia. When I show this to students, I like to describe this like a crashing wave. Not every technique needs to be at kind of a steady pace. You can have this first part which is crashing and quick, and then it slows down and mellows out. You can turn that into alternating forearms. This can really loosen and warm up that low back. Again, I'm primarily using those fronts of my forearm because I'm passing over the spine here. If I were to supinate my wrists here, I'd be using my ulna, and that ulna would be rubbing over these vertebral processes. No fun. So, use this pronated hand for this application. Now, coming from the low back, I can, as I'm spreading out like this, I can then get behind my own elbow. So I'm coming this way, and that's angling that pressure up and making it more of a myofascial angle. And then I'm going to come up and around the superior angle of the scapula. Let me give you another angle of that. So I'm scooping, and then I'm spreading apart and shifting away from my own arm to make it that myofascial angle. And now I'm leading with that olecranon process and leaning toward the head of the table. And then this entire forearm creates this circle around the scapula. Then you can follow that with this other forearm. So when you're using this one, you can again scoop upward. At this point, you're incorporating QL. So you can emphasize that by bringing your forearm into a more up and down configuration like this. So my forearm is pointed up toward the ceiling. and that will get a little more acutely into that QL. You'll notice that I have my wrist at a neutral angle, so the ulna is getting into this tight space here. And then I'm going to allow my wrist to stay in that position. So now I'm presenting this part of my forearm. So I start with this kind of sharp ulna, and then I carve around, come into this soft part of my forearm, and again I'll come up toward this superior angle. So I'm working with lower, mid, and a bit of upper trapezius, but this time I'm going to stop here and I'm going to come outward. I'm going to do a nice steamroll down this entire scapula. Once again, I've already done this particular move. I'm going to follow it with this arm that's closer to the foot of the table. And I'm coming up this quadratus lumborum region, this QL, and then I'm veering so that my forearm travels next to the spine, coming up, 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 making some nice compression of the upper back, and then once I'm able to encompass this entire scapular region, I come outward. Look how I roll so that I'm presenting even more of this fleshy flexor part of my forearm. And I'm steamrolling down all of these rotator cuff muscles, etc., etc. And you can stop right here at the line of the axilla of the armpit and apply some pressure. There's a lot of good tendinous material right here. Applying some pressure here feels nice. Before we move on, a quick word about body mechanics. So I'm using this very low table. During some of these demonstrations, you may have seen me come into a bit of a bend in my back here. I only do that if I'm about to be giving most of my body weight to the client. I do try to keep a straight back most of the time, but, you know, I'm human. But you, the viewer, should try to keep a fairly neutral curve in your back. Keep your butt out when you're leaning forward. But to make this as lazy as possible, which I am wont to do, I will go into these moves, and then I'll make a few points of contact with the table. So for instance, I've got my wrist, my palm planted on the corner of the table here. As I come into this, I'll lean my thigh against the table, and I'll probably lean my other thigh against the table. At this point, I'm in a full lounge. I'm giving weight to my client, I'm giving weight to the table using this other hand, and I'm giving a lot of my body weight to the side of the table by leaning. And you'll notice that I'll lean further and further into the table. So at no point am I having to do a lot of work. Now coming out of this, I want to come into a fairly neutral position and then stand up, rather than coming from here and then using my back to yank myself back up. That's no good. Now let's have another look at this move coming from the top down. So I'm going to plant my non-working hand on the table here. So that's going to take some of my weight. I'm going to plant my leg against the table to take even more of my weight. At this point, I've got a pretty good lounge going. So I can choose how much pressure to give to my client based on how much weight I'm taking off with these other supports. So if my client can take pretty good pressure, I will stay over them. The further your center of gravity is over your client, the more of your weight that you'll be able to effortlessly give them. Because I'm doing a nice stripping stroke right next to the spine, I'm using my ulna, so I'm staying in this neutral hand position. But as I get further down here, I don't want my olecranon process to strike the spine, so I'm going to angle and take this all into that fleshy anterior part of the forearm. And you can bring this all the way down into the superior hip region. I'm hoping that I've given you some ideas for this elbow forearm thing, but just some other quick examples. You can always transfer from a palmar move into that forearm. And notice how I'm bracing myself on the table. I'm bracing myself against the table using my leg. And what I'm doing with my forearm here is I'm following a path made by this greater trochanter and the ischial tuberosity. I'm going between those two, so I'm following the path of the sciatic nerve. And there's all sorts of good stuff that attaches if you follow this groove. All sorts of good external rotators. And you can come all the way north like this. If I also had the low back exposed, I could bring this up into the low back.
You're kind of starting to look like a sloth. You know, with the facial hair and everything.
Thanks, Summer.
It's a good thing. It's cute.
All right. One last one before we go. The forearm is excellent for working with this lateral thigh. So stripping up along this IT band and coming up into the tensor fascia lata. And you can hold that there for a little while. You can introduce some movement. And you can follow it with the other forearm. Notice how I'm just allowing her leg to roll inward like this. That's giving that IT band and all of its related muscles a bit of a stretch. Alright guys, let me know what you think. Leave me some comments. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.